Can you recall the last movie you watched that kept you awake at night or, for bonus points, gave you a legitimate nightmare?
Honestly, the two recent examples I can think of horror movies that have really kept me up like through that night are The Witch and Hereditary, unfortunately. It's a very lame answer, but I don't know. The Witch, I was staying with a friend from college who lived kind of like out in the woods in the middle of nowhere, and I remember being like genuinely frightened about being like surrounded by woods. And then after Hereditary, I had like terrible sleep paralysis. Like one of the few times that I remember like actually like seeing like a figure. And I don't know, there's a lot of like, kind of like looming in the distance in that movie. And it got me thinking of that. So yeah, A24, their style of horror has worked for me at least twice.
I don't remember as an adult, not to be like, I'm a big man or anything, but I don't feel like as an adult, I think I'm just so, I think the way I watch movies is detached and skeptical. And they don't hit as hard as they did when I was a kid. But when I was a child, I couldn't watch anything even vaguely frightening without having nightmares. And the thing that sticks with me, I couldn't watch horror movies, so I didn't until I was late into my 20s. But the thing that used to get me most often was the theme song to Unsolved Mysteries. My parents would watch it, and I would hear it from the other room, and it would bug me out for hours at a time.
Well, we're going to be talking about some more nightmares today because we are back for another episode of Split Picks for our special October horror series. We're talking about some of the great American horror directors. My name is Craig, I'm the host of Split Picks, and today we are discussing the career of Wes Craven. I'm being joined once again by Jim Hickox.
Howdy.
Jim, how you doing today?
Good, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. It's Friday,
Yeah. The weather's cooling off. That's exciting for me here in Texas.
See, we were starting to cool off in Portland, but then today it's 88 degrees, and we had sweatshirts on this morning. It's like, wait, no, we're done with this. So.
Growing up in the Northeast, it was like we always had to plan our trick-or-treating outfits over snow pants, and down here it's like on the 31st, it'll be probably in the 70s.
Yeah, different worlds.
I'm waiting for that, for it to be not just unbearably sweaty.
And joining us from Philadelphia, Bennett, you're back once again. How are you doing?
Not too bad. How's it going, everybody? I don't have bugs in my apartment this time around, but I have some weird leak by the baseboard on the one wall in my bedroom. It's like just damp and like slimy.
It's a deadly mold, probably.
Uh-oh.
Probably, yeah. So another thing that I thought I was done with, my last apartment had some black mold. Hopefully this one, I don't know, has a less serious type of mold. But happy to be here. Happy to be back on Split Picks.
It's from that Tobe Hooper movie. Mortuary. Yeah. It's coming for you.
Well, we all gotta go someday.
So if you're new to this series, we have previously covered Tobe Hooper with Bennett and Jim. That episode was an absolute blast. We looked at spontaneous combustion and life force. After that, we looked at John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness and John Carpenter's Vampires. And that was with...
good choices.
Yeah,
those are both bangers.
They're good ones. And that was with Steve Collins and John Merriman. It's a blast. Check that episode out.
Right on. Austin guys.
Yeah.
Austin guys.
And next week, we'll be finishing up the series with George A. Romero. That'll be another great one. But today, we are here for Wes Craven. And he is a guy who is credited with essentially changing the face of horror 3 times. We're going to get through all that. But we have a matchup today that I honestly never would have predicted. Jim, you selected what is probably his most overtly religious film, probably outside of Serpent and the Rainbow.
That's true.
What can you tell us about the movie you selected?
I have selected Deadly Blessing. I feel like it feels like a crucial pivot point for me. I think there are, as you sort of said, he's credited with reinventing the genre or like contributing largely to the genre at 3 different points, which means there are 2 sort of major pivot points, and I think this is one of them. I came into this Wes Craven experiment having just seen the big bangers, right? And now I've watched a bunch of stuff, and coming into it, I was like, oh, really the stuff that Wes Craven does that sings is his like really tight stuff. But it turns out nothing he ever made was really tight. And something about this movie, it's also completely all over the place in the same way that I would now say almost all of his movies are, and maybe except the screams. But something about this one in particular makes it hang together for me in a way that a lot of them don't necessarily.
Yeah, no, I'll be honest. When I watched it like a month ago. It was one of the few Cravens that really didn't do anything for me. And then watching it again last night, I was like, oh wow, this is it's really something special. Although it's stylistically, it's the most like a Carpenter film of any of his films. But
That's
I found
true.
myself wishing that either Tobe Hooper or George Romero had directed it. It's so much more like in their wheelhouse, I feel like, and maybe it's just the Pennsylvania connection for Romero. But good as it is, and I like quite a lot about it. It's one of the Craven movies that I kind of wish someone else had taken a stab at.
I don't want to go too far down this road necessarily, but I found myself almost all the ones I was excited about wishing Tobe Hooper had made them instead.
Oh.
So, Jim, I was in a similar boat as you, where I'd seen, Scream and a few others, but not many Cravens. He has a really interesting career, so I'm excited to talk about him today. I know there's so many instances of studio interference where they would like change the endings entirely and just make him change things, and so I really don't know how good of a director he actually is, because I don't know how much of his original stuff we've actually seen.
Right.
But Bennett, you picked one from 1989. What did you pick and why?
I picked Shocker, and I picked it because I think it is Wes Craven's best film. I think it combines the stuff he's doing in the better earlier films, or his best earlier films, The Serpent and the Rainbow, A Nightmare on Elm Street, this sort of dream logic, dream world stuff, with the exploration of media and its impact on society that he would get into in the Scream movies. And it blew me away the first time I watched it. It is such a wild, inventive, surprising film. And it just makes you pump your fists. I don't know.
I knew that was going to come up.
It's full of great metal music. And there are sequences that I just found myself like... I've never been a guy who listens to metal, but I've listened to the soundtrack for this just embarrassingly a lot. The Megadeth cover of No More Mr. Nice Guy is probably like going to be my most played song for 2021 on Spotify this year.
So, Bennett, why don't we go to the beginning with Wes Craven? Because I know you've looked into his career a bit more than me. Can you give us a little background into who Wes Craven is and how he made his way into the film world?
Yeah, for sure. So if you read like an interview with Wes Craven or a profile or like an obituary, they'll usually mention a couple of things about how he got his start in film. They'll mention that he had a fundamentalist religious upbringing, which was such that, much like Paul Schrader, he didn't see a film. They don't really have much else in common, to be honest. They're both a little pretentious too, I guess. But much like Paul Schrader, he didn't see a film until he was college aged, and even then did so at his own peril. And he was a college professor before, and like a high school teacher before becoming a filmmaker.
What did he teach?
English, and
that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
He has a master's in English and a master's in philosophy. So he got his start in filmmaking relatively late. And I don't know. We were talking a little bit about this off mic. He doesn't draw a lot of obvious influences from cinema, which I think really differentiates him from the other kind of masters of horror. I think Carpenter in particular, everybody loves to write about the comparison between Carpenter and Hawks, and like it's not evident that Craven has ever seen a Howard Hawks movie. Last House on the Left is, sort of a remake of Ingmar Bergman's film The Virgin Spring, but that's one of the only films you ever hear Wes Craven talk about or that anyone ever brings up in discussing his films.
And it's also like, at that point, was he like, I love this movie, or was he like, I want to make a movie? What's a movie that's kind of generally considered great that I can just lift from, right? It's like, it seems like a practical decision more than an artistic influence.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, from what I've gathered, his start in filmmaking was basically that like students of his were interested in making films, and he sort of like started working with them. And then at one point, his sort of like department head basically came to him and was like, "What the hell? You're like fucking around with a movie camera. You're supposed to be publishing. You're supposed to be working on your PhD. So either get on track or quit." And he apparently like quit and moved out and started making films. His career is really interesting compared to the other kind of horror masters, because they all have kind of moments where they, fall out of favor of, the money guys or audiences. And Craven kind of, like we said, reinvents the genre in separate decades a couple of times. And his high points are followed by conspicuous low points, conspicuous moments of obscurity. Much like what we saw with Hooper, he is incapable of directing an uninteresting movie. Everything is sort of full of wild flourishes and interesting touches. And I don't know, for me, I think he's most interesting when he's working in dream worlds.
So he made some TV movies as well. So we're going to focus just on the, theatrical movie releases. So out of the gates, he made Last House on the Left.
Yeah.
That's the first one that people credit him with kind of reshaping horror because it went places that no one had really gone before.
It's a better movie than I remembered.
Yeah.
I think today it gets tagged for being a little like tonally inconsistent and a little amateurish, but
so's everything he made.
Yeah, exactly. Like
those are his hallmarks as a director.
Those aren't bugs. Yeah, those are features. Yeah. It's a pretty interesting movie. I think people made a lot of hay out of it being influenced by like Vietnam at the time. It being about like this violent impulse kind of resting in polite society. I mean,
it is ultimately very, very based on Virgin Spring. I think I was trying to think about if it is sort of, because people talk about it as sort of this important bridge between art, film, and exploitation, right? Or like the thing that brings the rape revenge into exploitation, which is we see that movie. There's probably 4 playing at Fantastic Fest right now, right? It's a perennial favorite, the rape revenge. I mean, I think it is one of the earlier exploitation versions of that. I think it is important, and I think it is. I also agree that it's better than I remembered it being, but I also remembered it being pretty boring. And I think it's fine. I think it's a fine movie.
It's fun when the parents do all the Home Alone ass traps at the end. Like, I don't know, when he like contrives to have the guy that get like electrocuted by trying to open the door and the shaving cream in the ground and stuff. Despite the subject matter, Craven could still have a little bit of fun. With the third act. Not to be like the IMDb trivia section, but another interesting tidbit I learned about Wes Craven is he had never seen a horror movie until making Last House on the Left.
I believe that.
He saw Night of the Living Dead during the production. Was the only horror movie he had seen. So
that's funny.
These four masters of horror that we're covering here in October, they all
touched each other.
They touch each other, yeah.
So then after that, he made The Hills Have Eyes, which, it's regarded now as a classic, but at the time it was kind of just like a good movie, I think.
It's in very like similar thematic territory. Like, polite, educated, urbane liberals getting pushed to, violent ends.
And I think it's intentionally, right? I think somebody was like, I'll give you money to make that movie again, and he did.
I think he basically, like, the conceit was that, he would make basically the same movie in a new setting.
Yeah, it feels to me like a lesser Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This was one of the ones that I remembered being pretty tight, right? Because it's a very small conceit. I mean, it's basically the same conceit as Last House on the Left, but I remembered it being pretty tight. And then I watched it and I was like, oh no, it's not. This movie is a shambling mess of things. Just things happen all over the place, and some of them are really fun, and a lot of them I was like, oh, okay.
So the thing to me that stands out about his first 2 films is that they do deal with people's terrible impulses and people's breaking points and like what happens when we go too far or are pushed beyond our limits. And that brings us to Deadly Blessing because, he was raised in this super strict Baptist society. And then he comes on as a director for hire, basically, for Deadly Blessing. So, Jim, do you want to give us just a little intro to the movie and what it's all about?
Here's what I think makes it so delightful for me is that it's about 8 things. That's too many. I can't fill that number. But it's about a woman who has married a guy. They introduced this group of like not quite Amish people that they called the Hittites, and I was like, that's real people. What if they see it? But then I looked it up later, and the Hittites died out in 1200 BC or something, so they're not going to see it. Even if they were alive, they wouldn't because they don't go to the movies. But he has like this anti-electricity sort of pseudo-Amish clan called the Hittites.
Well, what's the line? They say the Hittites make the Amish look like swingers.
The Amish look like swingers.
Swingers, yeah. Who are led by Ernest Borgnine, who's like channeling Devil's Reign the whole time, which is, for me, I think the number 2 Satan in movies, Devil's Borgnine in Devil's Reign. After, of course, Prince of Darkness by John Carpenter, The Tube of Goo is my number 1 Satan.
That is a great devil.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's Ernest Borgnine is the father, Isaiah, of this clan of people who one of them was allowed to go off to college, and he met a girl, and has somehow obtained a farm that I think used to be part of the Hittite farm, even though he has been disowned by the Hittites, and he and his wife live there now, and are sort of cast out and reviled by the Hittites, including Michael Berryman, who is sort of an early, ooh, this is probably the bad guy, I think, because we're coming off of The Hills Have Eyes, right? Wes Craven, charmingly, which I think this is another sort of precursor to his meta-textual filmmaking later on, is that he's like, I'm taking the bad guy from my last movie and putting him in this movie, and you're going to think he's the bad guy, but then he's not, right? Which is clever. And then, so it's about them, and then the guy dies, and there's creepy neighbors, and one of whom makes twisted paintings, and there's a bunch of these Hittite kids creeping around, and then the ex-wife's, this is getting messy, I'm sorry, it's Wes Craven's fault, not mine, and then the widower's friends show up, and simultaneously we have maybe people are getting murdered. Well, people are. The Michael Berryman gets murdered. The husband is murdered, and we don't know who's doing it. It could be one of the Hittites. The neighbors are weird and seem like weirdly sexually attracted to everybody. And Sharon Stone, who's one of the friends, is having insane hallucinations, sort of totally separately. And also the murderer is just showing up and doing pranks for some reason. The Hittites are convinced that that someone is like the spawn of the devil, or like a precursor to the devil, or talking to the devil, who they're calling an incubus. Yeah, is that the whole plot? That's the whole 2/3.
That was only 14 plot points, Jim.
Okay, I did enough. Oh, and then also the other friend is maybe seducing one of the Hittite men. Right, this is important. Whose cousin fiance starts running around near the end and is also, we think, maybe doing murders, or maybe just crazy, or maybe just scorned by her husband.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. And the guy that she starts like dating is is like the brother of the guy who was killed by the tractor early on in the film.
I thought they might have just been using the word brother because everyone called Isaiah father. But it might have been his literal brother. I'm unclear.
I guess I don't know. I mentioned that I thought maybe I would like this movie better if George Romero directed it, because the Amish-esque setting suggests it's maybe Pennsylvania. I also think Lincoln Mazel from Martin and the Amusement Park would have made a meal of not Ernest Borgnine, the other sort of elder, the guy from The Hills Have Eyes' father. He would have made a meal of that.
That dude shows up. He's Michael Berryman's father, who calls Ernest Borgnine brother. Who maybe they're literal brothers. It's hard to tell. Probably, right? They're probably all supposed to be inbred. And yeah, he is there, and he does fine. But he definitely, someone who knew how to chew stuff up would have been really delightful in that space.
Ernest Borgnine got a Razzie nomination, which just shows that they've never known what they were talking about. Yeah,
that's so stupid.
Incredible.
He's great.
He should have been in a Tobe Hooper movie.
He's not even at full Borgnine in this movie. He's at like 80% Borgnine, and he's still like chomping at it. He's giving an appropriate performance, I think.
So that is one thing I wanted to ask about, because pretty much everything I've read about this movie, every writer takes a shot at the actress, whether it's Sharon Stone, because this was like her first feature role.
Sure.
And apparently she was asking Wes Craven, like, hey, I've never really acted before. Can you give me some tips? And he'd just be like, just read your part.
Well, here's something that I don't know if this is a controversial opinion or not, because I've read nothing. But I would posit that across all these movies I watched, I was never like, oh, Wes Craven's a good director. If you're watching somebody's movies and no actor ever gives a better performance than they would in a room alone, then that means they're not a good director. And I don't think he, in any of the movies I watched, gets anything out of anybody that they didn't bring themselves. I think that he's a creative writer, and I think that he pulls together a lot of fun projects. But I don't think as a director he's ever really bringing much to the table.
I think he got to be a pretty good director. Granted, he's leaning heavily on like his special effects artists and his production designers there.
Yeah.
But I think he gets to be a pretty good, or at least a pretty interesting director in like the dream movies like Nightmare, Serpent, Shocker, when he's sort of playing around with like dream sequences and really like.
I think he makes lovely sequences. I'm talking about directing actors.
He's a bad director of actors.
The baseline level of directing, I think he's not great at. I think he's really good at pulling things together, and I do think you mentioned this earlier. I think that he's very good with like effects and with pulling and like bringing a team together to make a spectacle. Right? He like kills it at that. And conceiving of like beautiful moments and bringing them together. I think he does a lot of things very well, but I think directing actors is not one of them.
Yeah, and I think music of the heart is what like confirmed that for me. Like I'm not. I think Meryl Streep is generally kind of like, not to quote Donald Trump, but I do think she's kind of overrated. But she's really bad in music from the heart, as is like everybody. And I don't know, watching him like, you know, working with like what the studio figured was like an easy layup of a script and like a cast of like the you know, quote unquote best actors he would ever work with, and just kind of whiff like he never whiffed before. Yeah, I agree. He's not a very good director of actors.
But I don't think that's necessarily how we should be judging him, right? It's not. That's almost none of his movies, except potentially Music from the Heart, are based around having great performance, right? They're about he like had some wild ideas and wants to put them on a screen, and I respect that a lot. If people are all taking swings at these actors, I think those performances aren't the best of any of those people's careers, right? All of them do better under better circumstances. But I think, you know, they're all doing the best they can with the support they probably had.
The way he directs actors can sometimes work in his favor, and his choice of actors can sometimes work in his favor. Like, I think Nightmare on Elm Street... Well, yeah, Lillard is a good example, but I think Nightmare on Elm Street works well because like so many of the characters are pretty like ordinary and they act like regular people.
Sure.
Not to like sound like I'm quoting myself when I'm talking about like Clint Eastwood working with non-professionals or you know inexperienced actors, but I think there's some of the same thing. Like,
just say Bresson instead of Eastwood, and then you're.
It feels very like unmannered and authentic occasionally. Like I think Heather Langenkamp is like the perfect level of actor to work with Wes Craven. I think she really like. She doesn't seem like an actor acting like she's in some sort of like nightmare scenario. She seems like a person experiencing this like nightmare scenario. And like if Wes Craven was a more like quote unquote expert director with actors, he might have like coached her into some sort of really like over the top performance.
If he was Tobe Hooper, he would have. I think that you're right in a lot of the Dream films, and I think also in Deadly Blessing to a degree, part of what makes them work is that he has these people who are giving sort of, I don't want to say wooden, but sort of unaffected performances, playing against people who are completely unhinged, right? Because all those people who are doing it in the Nightmare movies, right, who are like there and are like they are just reading the lines, right, like you said, Craig. They're all going up against Robert Englund, who is an absolute madman, right? And he's like, I get this character. I am a weasel. Here I go. And if the person they had cast wasn't completely off the chain, if they didn't have a Brad Dourif type to play Freddy Krueger, then I don't think the movie would hang together. You know what I mean? If he was also kind of just there, but having that big of a energy difference, I think that's how a battery works, right? You have to have your node and your anode.
So, Jim, in the Tobe Hooper episode, you said Hooper's not necessarily a great writer, but I think the direct quote was he will direct the shit out of whatever script he's given.
Sure.
Craven kind of seems to me to be the flip side of that, where he's a fairly decent writer, but I do want to bring up studio interference here because, like I said, we don't know what this movie would have looked like if someone else directed it. It sounds like he rewrote a ton of this. I mean, how do you feel this movie stands in comparison to his other work? Like, what's the quality level here?
I, unlike Bennett, did very terrible research. I based my I like looked at on his Wikipedia page. I still have it open actually. There's a list of like, was he a writer on this movie? And I was like, oh yeah, he basically wrote everything up until New Nightmare. Almost everything, and then he basically stopped writing his movies, which I think is interesting. But what I didn't realize is that I read this shortly before we started recording, that he apparently was given a script on this movie and then did a big rewrite on it, right? I am curious what this movie would have been like, because I read that the dudes who originally wrote it were like, oh, all the like jump scares and everything in this movie are basically Wes Craven. He like brought in these like big these big moments, which makes sense because that is, as I just said, I think is sort of where he's the strongest, is like the thing where like a body falls down in the barn and then there's nobody there and the door swings closed or whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting you talked about this being sort of a pivot movie, and it starts to become sort of, it's like half a dream movie, the way that Nightmare on Elm Street and Serpent and Shocker would be. And there's obviously like a very deliberate, there's a shot that's lifted almost wholesale for Nightmare, the shot in the bathtub. There's also, when Sharon Stone is running around in the barn and there's like a little hole she's trying to escape through, it's very reminiscent of Rose McGowan in Scream. So I think we can see some of like what would become persistent ideas for him starting to percolate in this movie. But yeah, maybe it's studio interference, maybe that it was someone else's script originally. He's only like part of the way there. And like, as we've talked about, even at his best, he probably only gets like 90% of the way there. Yeah. So, you know, not to keep shitting on Wes Craven. Like, I would rank him fourth among the horror guys, but I do like all of his films. Besides,
exactly. I enjoyed everything I watched in preparation for this. We should put that caveat on. Yeah, except for Hills 2. Any of these is worth taking a swing at. They're all good. I just don't have the I don't have a burning passion for him that I do for some of the others. But I do actually have, I think, more respect for him after rewatching a bunch of these movies than I thought I did. Because they get a lot. I think of him as a pretty dry director, a pretty dry creator who, in my brain previous to this, I was like, he's like not super crazy. And then he like came up with a Nightmare where the conceit is like, ooh, everything's dreams, and that let him get wild. But that's not true. All of his movies are full of kind of nutso ideas, right? And I think that's what when I started watching this one, Deadly Blessing, I was like, oh, he's taking the idea of like a folk horror movie, right? Of like Blood on Satan's Claw or the Wicker Man, right? He's taking like the idea of the folk horror and
Midsommar,
and setting it in the 1970s, which I think is delightful. That's not a thing we see often. And it does sort of start that way, and it sort of feels that way for a while, and then it gets way weirder than that. But it's that sort of combined with, I feel like Sharon Stone is sort of in her own movie. But what I haven't said is how the movie ends, which is it ultimately ties all the things together in sort of just a real 1-2 punch of an ending where it's been, you've had. It's really a 1-2-3 punch. There's one punch in this movie that I'm not stoked about. So we've had, it's like the mother-daughter team who live next door, who the daughter paints crazy paintings, which are unbefitting a young woman. And there's the Hittites who are maybe doing murders. And there's Sharon Stone, who is having these insane hallucinations. And there's the husband who's dead. And there's the woman who's still living in this house. And they think she's an incubus, a traditionally male demon. And so then... Oh, and there's the cousin fiance. Sorry, I keep forgetting the cousin fiance.
Do you think they confuse the terms incubus and succubus in this?
I don't.
The being they're describing seems to be like a succubus of some sort. They characterize the incubus as this like parasitic female spirit. Which, I don't know much about demonology, but that's not the incubus's deal, right?
Do they specifically say it's female?
I think so. Okay. They're always accusing like women of being the...
Yeah, but they mostly say like it's the messengers of the succubus. Or
yes, the
incubus,
messengers.
Sorry.
Right. I don't want to ruin anything for y'all, but it turns out that the daughter of the woman down the lane is intersexed. She has both male and female genitalia. And I think that's why they're using incubus in this one. I think it is intentional because she is female presenting, but is in some way, they like rip her shirt open and she has a very male chest. And they're like, ha!
No, I forgot about that. Maybe it's because I wanted to forget about that.
Because it's really the worst. I mean, it's the movie's from the late 70s, in the early 80s, when it's almost the same twist, not to ruin it, as Sleepaway Camp, right? Except they don't put a point on it. It's just kind of a thing that happens,
right?
And I didn't feel great about it. It's sort of the worst thing. It has aged the worst out of anything in this movie, I think, and it's the most. It kind of happens, and you're like, oh. That doesn't have to be there.
From a thoughtful, like really obviously like intellectual director, it's sort of a bummer too.
Yeah, it's weird. And I was trying to figure out, because he is a literate, thoughtful man. You know, I was trying to. I was like, maybe it's, you know, Baphomet is traditionally depicted with boobs and a penis, so maybe he was trying to do like an inversion of that. But I don't know. I think I'm just being generous. I think it must have been from the original script. I don't know. Anyway, that happens, but then that's sort of revealed as the secret that this woman and her intersex daughter have been hiding, and they're the murderers. They've been doing murders, and so that's revealed, and then everyone gets murdered, and then the man, the ex-Hittite, whose wife we've been following for the whole movie, his ghost just appears right at the end. And you're like, oh, there are ghosts now. And he's like, look out for the incubus. And then the devil swallows the house whole, basically, from the inside.
It's kind of like the ending of Spontaneous Combustion. Like, someone gets sucked into a portal, and it just kind of ends. Like, you feel like there's something missing.
And you're like, up until then, it has been 4 sort of disingenuous storylines that all coincide, and for me, hang together enough. I was delighted that it was like several different people doing different things, and that they were all just kind of there, and they all happened to like center around this house. And then at the end, they're like, it's out around this house because it's the devil. And you're like, oh, okay, I guess it's the devil is underneath this house. Okay, which is fine, but it also wasn't necessary.
I definitely don't mind that it doesn't really cohere. People like overuse comparing things to Giallo or Gialli. Excuse me, let's use the plural here. But the fact that there's like a black gloved killer and like a lot of nudity and like it feels like a Giallo movie. You know, people are using that to defend slop like Malignant now, but you know, I feel like it's maybe not quite apt, but like somewhere near apt to compare Deadly Blessing to a Giallo. I
mean, it is until the devil shows up at the end. It is fundamentally a Giallo, right? It's just people doing murders. There's nothing actually supernatural until there is 2 minutes from the end of the film.
Yeah, and even if it doesn't like fully commit to focusing on the killings, it's at least in part like a Giallo or a slasher with this other kind of folk horror stuff happening alongside it. Yeah,
which I think is delightful. I enjoy all of those things.
So most people that I've read online said that the studio tacked on the final ending, but I found another article from Manor Vellum, which this is just an amazing piece about religion in Wes Craven's work. I trust this writer more than the rest of the internet. But he found a quote that Craven was saying he himself changed the ending. So I don't know what to make of it, because it seems to make more sense when it's like, well, yeah, the studio threw this thing in that like kind of upends the entirety of the rest of the movie. But hearing that Craven did it himself, what's your takeaway on that?
I mean, that could be a situation where the studio is like, you need to have an ending that makes it all hang together. Figure one out, right? And then he's inventing what that means for him. Mm-hmm. Here's the thing with Wes Craven is that I think that his moments are stronger than his films, and I think that this film, as I said earlier, it's the sort of disparate elements for me gelled into a continuum better than a lot of the movies did, which I think is what I was reacting to when I picked this one. And I think it has a lot of good moments. I don't think it has the best moments. I think, Bennett, your movie has, I think, the best moment in Wes Craven's whole career. And I think that a few of his other movies have really strong moments. But I think this movie has really good moments. But there weren't points in this movie where I was like, let's get back to some moments. The whole time I was pretty much having a good time. So the idea that ending would have been tacked on by a studio or requested by a studio makes a lot of sense, because it's a real tonal, like, hard left. But I also don't, I think, super care. I enjoy it. I think if the movie ended without that moment, I would be totally gratified with the ending. I think it ending with that moment, I'm still totally gratified with the ending. You know, I literally think any movie could end in a satisfying way, and then have a coda where the devil explodes out of the floor, pulls everyone down to hell, and the house turns black, and then the sun rises outside, and I would be like, great.
I thought that was the best part of the movie, personally. Like, we're talking about good moments. Like, come on,
it is a really strong,
on the subject, Craig, of him like wanting this ending, I was saying to Jim, like, maybe he was like trolling. Maybe it's like, you want an ending? Here's a fucking ending, sort of a situation.
The studio's like, you have to tie these threads together, and he's like, okay, asshole.
It's a weird movie in his career because I don't think of him as being an images director. I think of him as being like a sequence director and an idea director. He's not like the best stylist. He doesn't have like the best compositions, but there's some great compositions in this, especially
There
for
are
a movie
weirdly
on a
good
not
compositions
high
in
budget
this.
from a pretty inexperienced director. Although he does that same thing where the spider web slowly comes into focus.
Yeah, he
like
loves
3
that.
times.
He
The
loves
first time
that.
I was like, "Whoa, cool." Second time I was like, "All right," and the third time I was like, "Oh, this sucks."
Yeah. Because he was really, there's like trying to tie the spider in with the incubus. She like has a dream about a spider man, not a spider man, but a spider man. Which again, like none of that matters.
They
But he
never
sure does
connected,
it.
though.
No, they do drop a tarantula into Sharon Stone's mouth, which is something.
Yeah, crazy scene.
Yeah.
Worse than the snake, as far as I'm concerned.
Worse than the snake.
Yeah.
The snake is funny. I think a lot of what's happening in this movie is a little bit underwhelming, right? Like people fill spaces up with chickens a couple of times. This black gloved murderer breaks into their house and just puts a snake in her bathtub. There are a few moments where like a dangerous thing is happening, but it's just they feel like low level pranks, which is interesting. I think I don't know. I enjoyed it. I was charmed by how kind of doofy a lot of the elements were.
A lot of this stuff kind of predicts where he's going, and I feel like his movies as a whole kind of predict what's coming and call back to each other. Like Jim, especially as a filmmaker, like what do you make of reusing bits like that?
Oh, I think it's great. I think he's like developing a playbook, right? He's got a sketchbook and he's pulling out. He's like, oh, I'm gonna redo that, but I'm gonna do it even better this time. I think it's charming. I think it's also fun to watch Scream as Bennett, as you said, and see Rose McGowan get stuck in the garage door and be like, oh, I see the lineage of that, right? I've watched you. It sort of makes me feel closer to him as a human being than if it was just rando stuff.
So I was like, obviously, like mostly joking earlier when I compared him to Paul Schrader, but it's actually interesting that you bring up the subject of using the same images and the same ideas again and again, because as you both, I'm sure, know, Paul Schrader has recreated Robert Bresson's Pickpocket like 7 times. I love when directors do that. I love when you can see the lineage. I love when they do exactly the same thing. Now, I don't love it when it's in the same movie, like the spiderweb thing. But I found it pretty thrilling to watch like all of Wes Craven's movies in short succession and see, the callbacks and stuff and see the pet themes. I mean, it's what auteurism is all about. And if you're not an auteurist, hey man, I don't know. I don't think you like movies, or you don't like them the right way.
That's funny. I don't believe in auteurism. I'm vehemently against the idea. Ben and I are about to go fight in the parking lot.
I mean, there'll be a lot of fist bumping, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You guys will just be better friends by the end.
We're about to go bro down in the parking lot. Hold on.
So I will say I didn't fully pay attention the first time I watched this movie because
It requires a lot of attention.
Yes, Jim, I honestly did not see you picking this one. A lot of the characters look the same, especially with the blonde women. And
there's a lot of blonde women.
And the guys in the Amish garb.
Yeah.
They're all wearing identical
together,
outfits.
yeah.
The only one who looks different is Michael Berryman, and he's murdered 25 minutes into the
he's
movie.
not even much
Right.
of a-
But Jim, we have kind of heard why you like this movie, but to close this out, can we get your sales pitch on why people should watch Deadly Blessing?
Sure, yeah. I think that, as I said, it's the first major pivot point, I think, for Craven. It's between his like really grimy early stuff or his comparatively really grimy. He never got super grimy, but it's his grimiest stuff and his sort of big budget bangers. And it feels like his first swing at a big budget banger. And I think that it is. I think it's super fascinating if you're interested in Wes Craven to see this sort of pivot point, this major motion in his career. Because for me, his shift from then making bangers to making even bigger bangers is less interesting than his shift from making the as filthy as he's willing to get into the dream movies.
Yeah, we talked about the weird trajectory his career took, where it goes from like high to low, and I think in a career like that, a film like this that's a swing and like a foul ball becomes more interesting, because I don't know, you can kind of see why he came in and out of fashion with a movie like this. That
absolutely,
from minute to minute is going in and out of being good or even coherent. Yeah, give it a watch. It's his most Carpenter-esque movie. It's got a lot of like POV stalking. It's a good-looking movie. Dude, we said this again while you were gone, Craig. Not to be such a dude about it, but Sharon Stone in this movie. I mean, fa va voom, hoi, mamma mia. Oh.
I somehow totally forgot to mention that she's pregnant, the main woman. Presumably that's the blessing, is the baby that she's pregnant with.
Well, their house is called Our Blessing.
The house is also called Our Blessing.
Bless this mess.
Yeah.
That should have been a tagline.
Yeah. If only he were more self-aware.
All right, we'll wrap up Deadly Blessing there. We'll move on to another banger coming up after a quick break.
You know what his last wish was? TV set in his cell. Can you believe that?
He must like his soaps, huh?
All right, my son. It's time to...
Stay away from the black spot. Get up. Come on! Give it to me!
You got it, baby.
So, between Deadly Blessing and Shocker, Wes Craven made a movie that kind of changed the trajectory of his career. Bennett, do you want to give us a quick rundown of what happened between these two films?
Yeah. So he makes a movie for DC Comics, an adaptation of the Swamp Thing comics. It is another movie that apparently had a lot of kind of studio interference. It was a disappointment, I believe, financially and critically. So it found him kind of down in made-for-TV land once again. He directs a film called Invitation to Hell. A lot of fun. Highly recommended. Then The Hills Have Eyes 2 comes out, long shelved. And then he makes A Nightmare on Elm Street. Another movie, much like Last House on the Left, that you can't know anything about Wes Craven and not know about. Kind of wildly innovative, acclaimed horror movie. Becomes a franchise, much to Craven's chagrin.
Is that a joke, or was he really sad about that?
I think he's not. I think he's pretty annoyed about the franchise.
That seems like his whole MO is to try to make things that will make him passive income.
Well, but Jim, he sold the rights to the Freddy Krueger character.
Oh.
So it blew up.
That's why.
And yeah, I mean, not to get too far ahead.
So he didn't get his cut, is
right.
What
and that's part of why New Nightmare, he came back on board, because that was the only other one he directed of the series. And New Line Cinema was like, we should probably take care of you now. So it took a while for him to really see anything outside of acclaim from that franchise. But
I didn't realize that.
Then something happens with Shocker. What happens here, Bennett?
Well, he directs a few more films. Because his career is so weird, after Nightmare on Elm Street, he directs another made-for-TV movie called Chiller, which is pretty bad. I would say almost as bad as The Hills Have Eyes Part 2. It's only available in this like truly abysmal transfer that you can watch on Amazon. Not worth the effort. He makes Deadly Friend, he makes The Serpent and the Rainbow, and then he makes Shocker. Now, in writing about Shocker, I read an interview he did with Film Comment around the time of the release. It was sort of mid-production. He mentions that he is like consciously trying to outdo the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. He wants to introduce a character that's not only capable of carrying his own franchise, but is going to be so good and so like outrageous that they're going to be forced to retire Freddy and the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. Now, he didn't succeed. No one really remembers Shocker. No one really remembers Horace Pinker. And after Shocker, after the trio of studio films ending in Shocker, he goes back to directing for TV with a pretty underrated movie called Night Visions. So it's kind of bitterly ironic that in like trying to force Freddy Krueger into retirement, he's forced into a kind of retirement and then is ultimately forced to come back to not just that franchise, but then, get involved in like another ongoing franchise. So there's a sort of a tail between his legs quality to the post-Shocker part of Craven's career. But as I mentioned up top, I think Shocker kind of blends the best elements of Craven's best films and is a truly shocking movie with some of its visual choices and some of the kind of narrative surprises.
So yeah, I mean, this movie literally opens with the bad guy Horace Pinker in his lair, den, TV workshop. It's very reminiscent of Freddy's workshop, but he's working with just tons of TVs. is it a little too similar for the build-up? Is that part of the issue here for why it didn't take off as a franchise?
I mean, I just think people didn't know what to make of it. I think they were expecting something like Nightmare on Elm Street, and they sort of get that for the first 25 minutes. And then when it becomes less about dreams and more about TV, I think a lot of people probably changed the channel, so to speak. I think a lot of people might have hit mute when it became more about TV.
I mean, I do think the reason that I came into this whole project thinking of Wes Craven as a pretty slick, tight dude is because the things you think of are The Hills Have Eyes, which is so simple. Although more in concept than execution, and Nightmare on Elm Street, which is a really simple premise, but one that allows for just absolute levels of insanity, right? That's why it's so great. It's because you're like, ooh, you go into dreams, and then Freddy Krueger's arms are 15 feet long, and what a delight, right? And this movie, when you're watching it, you're like, he's definitely chomping at the bit to make a new Freddy Krueger. Which I didn't have the context for why he was doing that so much, but that absolutely makes sense. But Freddy Krueger is like he murdered children, parents murdered him in a boiler, and then there's a little bit of a logical jump to now he can kill you in your dreams. But that's it, right? That's the full backstory, and that's all you need. The Horace Pinker backstory is 45 minutes long and has 8 steps in it, right? It's just way too convoluted to be a tight little thing, and that's I think probably its the main reason that that and the ending of the movie I think are probably the main 2 reasons that this didn't successfully transcend into a franchise.
Bennett, can you set up Shocker for us? Tell us what's going on here before we get into the 8-step program.
Sure, yeah. So I'll note we open, like you mentioned, in Horace Pinker's workshop. And there's a lot of just violence on the various TVs around his workshop, for the most part unrelated to him. But as the credits wind to a close, we hear a news broadcast about a serial killer. No one knows his name, no one knows who he is, but for 9 months he's been eluding capture and keeping the people of this unnamed town that literally might as well be named Townsville awake at night. He's haunting their dreams, much like Freddy Krueger.
Little rich suburban town.
Jonathan Parker, again, might as well be named first name, last name. Might as well be named create a player. Is a high school quarterback or a college quarterback.
Receiver.
Might as well go to State U.
Yeah.
Oh, he is a receiver. I gotta change that in my essay. Yeah, he's a wide receiver for this college team, and his foster father is the cop. It's Michael Murphy, the guy who was Tanner in Tanner 88, is the cop who's on the trail of this serial killer. And he suffers an injury during practice, gets knocked out cold after running into the goalpost. And
like an idiot. He just does that.
Can I pause you right there, Bennett? I have a question about that scene, because 3 times in a row, in less than 2 minutes, he runs into the goalpost, he gets sacked for looking at his girlfriend with the ball or something or not sacked, he gets tackled on the sideline and doesn't get the touchdown. And then he runs into the water cooler and just whoa, falls over. Yeah. He's presented as the ultimate klutz. And then for the rest of the movie, he's just got balletic grace, and he's jumping across alleyways.
He jumps across a rooftop.
Yeah. It's
they definitely set him up as a different character than he is.
Yes. What's going on there?
I don't know. Maybe it was. Maybe it's the injury gave him superpowers, sort of thing. It does.
I think that's what they're doing.
It does.
Yeah, it gives him the ability to see into the future, sort of.
No, the present.
Well, it seems like it's a few minutes in the future almost, because he manages to get there in time.
Oh, I guess that's true. That's true.
It seems like he can see 10 minutes into the future almost.
But also project himself, because Horace Pinker interacts with him when he's there.
Right. And can see him and knows he's there. Yeah. It's very
also
hard to
other
explain.
people can too. When Horace is holding that lady at the top of the stairs, she also sees and interacts with him.
His mom responds, So he's walking home to go back to his dorm room and recuperate, and suddenly he realizes that he's on the street that he grew up on, where his foster family still lives. I think this is really effective, and I think this is where the cardboard, cookie cutter nature of both the settings and the characters really works in this movie's favor, because it felt authentically realizing you're dreaming to me when you realize you're in a familiar location that's just a little bit off, or just a little bit nondescript because you don't actually remember it that well. Like we sort of have that happen. Why are we on this street? Why is the TV repair van outside? He goes inside and happens upon Horace Pinker has already murdered his foster brother and is about to murder his foster mother and sister. As he tries to intervene, he goes through Horace Pinker's body. Craven, as you sort of alluded to, Jim, has always been kind of a master of practical effects. Yeah. And in this movie, he gets to do some pretty wild, low-budget looking, in a cool way, optical effects. Yeah, he jumps through Horace Pinker's body, wakes up, realizes that wasn't an ordinary dream. He gets a call from his dad. His foster family has been murdered. So now they know a little bit about the killer. And basically he starts using this dream power to aid the investigation.
To his father's chagrin, his stepfather's chagrin.
Yeah, hates it.
Yeah.
He's
really
like
leave me alone, I'm a cop, you're a kid. He's like, but I can dream into his world.
This movie doles out exposition by way of like TV news anchors who give out the most wildly detailed reports.
John Tesh, specifically.
They also they ask like these insane like personal questions. Like they're interviewing Michael Murphy out front of like the house where his family has been murdered. And like they say something like, "Now that the killings have affected you personally, will you speed up in catching the killer? Will you finally get the lead out of your ass?"
Like so rude.
So good, and they're wildly detailed in reporting the detail the investigation. They like give away that they're now using Jonathan's dreams to track Horace Pinker. So Horace Pinker figures out who he is, murders his girlfriend. So he goes back into a dream.
Well, because they get close. They almost catch him. So in retaliation, he murders his girlfriend.
Murders his girlfriend. And then he goes into a dream again. This time manages to stop Pinker. They have this awesome like chase and fight across two rooftops. So I mentioned before that Craven doesn't seem to be much of like a cinephile, doesn't seem to have a lot of like cinematic inspirations. Maybe it's purely subconscious, but he seems to take cues from silent cinema. Particularly like Buster Keaton, a lot of like the stunts and like practical effects and like somewhat like physical comedy. Like even in something like Scream, there's never like a clean kill. The guy's always getting like chased around. He's always getting like hit in the balls.
Yeah, or kicked and doing like a full cartwheel over somebody's leg or something.
They take a beating in Scream. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like those are the things he's most interested in are those sort of practical effects and those sort of wild physical motions and stuff, which I think is great. I really appreciate that about him.
Yeah.
So they have this like big fight, which is amazing. Like every bit of like the roof is like getting involved in the fight. He almost like shoves his face into like a fan. Pinker gets arrested. Pinker gets executed, but before he's executed, he does this like black magic ritual to summon like the spirit of television, which gives him like the powers to like channel electricity. Very, very unusual sequence.
That's the best part of the movie.
That's what I mentioned earlier. I think that's the best sequence out of any Wes Craven film I've seen, is that moment. In specific, the moment where he's like, give me this power, and a pair of lips come out of the static on the TV and say, you got it. And then suck back into the TV. Oh, you got it, baby. Right?
You got it, Daddy-o.
It's so brilliantly weird.
Yeah, and then he bites the prison guard's lip. Like, that scene is
so
amazing.
Gnarly.
This movie, like, it's built to feel like it's going to be just like, you know, they got to catch the killer thing, and that's going to be the whole movie. They catch him pretty fast for this movie. I know it's
like half an hour in.
A quarter or third of the way through the movie, yeah.
I will say it's overly long, but it takes a turn from there, and that's where it gets interesting, I'll say.
Yeah, the movie basically becomes one long chase. Pinker takes like forever to die, and then because of the nature of these like TV powers he has, he can now possess people.
He can travel through sockets.
He can take over people's body.
Is that it?
But,
that's it, kind of. And he can appear as a staticky version of himself.
That's kind of a ghost.
Kind of a ghost. Oh, P.S. People. Also, that girlfriend comes back as a ghost.
His girlfriend
you
comes
blew
back
past
as a ghost,
that,
naturally.
But
also,
it's an important plot point.
Like a staticky apparition.
Yeah.
And for some reason, this necklace that he gave her can thwart Pinker's powers and like cause the static
for a reason that is
leave
undefined.
Whatever bodies he's possessed, and whatever body he possesses still has his limp. Oh, and we find out he has that limp because he's Jonathan's real father. Jonathan shot him when he was a kid to try to stop him from killing his mother. So I think that's what you meant when you said that there's a lot of different.
There's just too much to get through, which I'm not against, right? Like my movie also has 8 plots that are sort of tumbling across each other. This one, the only reason I would say it's to the detriment is because he wanted it to become a pop banger, right? I was thinking in my head that like the Scream movies are like pop songs, and the movie I picked is like Alice Coltrane or something. And this movie is like
I wouldn't give it that much credit.
It's trying to. Well, I have medium feelings. I feel like she's also sort of like brilliant but messy.
All right.
And this movie, it's like in between somewhere, right? It's like he's trying to come up with that like tight pop banger, but he is not. He's like, you need 45 minutes of explanation for things that aren't like, the kid doesn't have to be a psychic. The girlfriend doesn't have to come back as a ghost. The necklace doesn't have to figure into it. He doesn't have to be
his son.
Pinker, none of that had to. It could, if it was 1 minute in, if it was child's play, right? If it was 1 minute in and the guy was like, I'm doing a voodoo ritual to become one with the TV, and then the rest of the movie happened from there on out, maybe it could have been a banger that people would have jumped on board with. But because he was
I'd argue it as a banger.
I'm saying like one that resonated with the pop world, right?
Yeah, in the popular imagination.
Yeah.
Banger, yeah. It's like a needlessly convoluted metal concept album. I think it's like a.
I wish it was more metal. I was a little bummed by how unmetal it was. I felt like
I wish there was more music. Yeah.
Yeah, there are like 4 really solid moments where you're listening to a metal song. But even in those moments, I was like, the things I'm watching aren't as metal as the things I'm hearing. And the rest of the movie, I just didn't feel like it was. I wanted it to be like Trick or Treat. Do you know that movie? Not with an R, but with an or. It's an 80s
only know
movie.
the one with the R.
I just wanted it to be. I wanted it to be more metal, and it never got there for me. I don't think Wes Craven listened to metal.
Yeah, no, I that was fully an affectation, but I think the one time it really works is when they're setting
is the
up
electric chair.
It's
Yeah, absolutely.
That song.
Yeah, of course.
Metal used poorly is the funniest thing in the world, because it's so distracting if it's not actually used well. Because like it just stands out like a sore thumb. It's like you couldn't think of anything else other than just like screaming with like 260 beats per minute. Like, come on, like you can do better than that.
Well, it's also every time he uses it, I think all the times I noticed it, it's done. It's not like soundtrack. It's like it is the entire soundtrack,
yes.
right? It's like all you're hearing. It's not like in the background somewhere. It's like we're listening to 2 minutes of Megadeth covering Alice Cooper, and we're watching some stuff happen.
Yeah.
It's not like just sort of dinkling along somewhere. He's like, or like we're preluding to them climbing that TV tower in a chase scene that is not nearly as intense as the song we're listening to.
Right.
But we're just listening to that song.
It's weird that, like, I don't know, among his goals here was to, like, I don't know, undo this sort of, like, franchisification of Freddy Krueger. You know, everyone says it, like, Freddy Krueger went from being, like, scary to being, like, funny. You know, he becomes this sort of, like, wisecracking mascot. But, like, Horace Pinker does a bit of that.
He starts there.
He bites the guy's fingers off and says, "Finger looking good."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I would argue so does Freddy Krueger in the first movie.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is like I don't necessarily agree that Freddy Krueger's not cracking jokes in the original one. Like he's a little more menacing, and he goes by Fred instead of Freddy.
Right.
Interestingly, until the second one. But yeah, no, I've never quite agreed with that contention. But I find it interesting that he wanted to like.
Horace Pinker makes
create, like,
a
an
bunch of
anti-Freddy.
really stupid jokes in this movie, but he also is set up as just like truly like Fred Krueger murdered children. Horace Pinker is just the most vile. He's awful to everyone.
A dead kid.
Oh, yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
He kills entire.
He kills 2
families.
kids on screen, right? Yeah, he's like also just so vile to everyone all the time for no reason. Like Freddy
Everything
Krueger,
he says is
Freddy Krueger
horrifying.
engages in discourse, right? Horace Pinker is just mean to everybody constantly. It's crazy.
And it's so funny when he possesses people and they become like that. Like, it's weird that, like, when he possesses people, they have his limp, but then, like, they also talk like him. So, like, of course, you know, it's used to great effect with the little girl.
With the little girl on the tractor, yeah.
Yeah, I think Pinker's biggest weakness is that he's just not likable. Like, Freddy, like, for as scary as he is, like, he's just kind of cool, you know? Like, he just has that, like, God, I don't want this guy in my nightmares. But Pinker's just like, yeah, I've seen that guy downtown before, you know?
Sure.
Yeah, Freddy has a look, and Horace Pinker just, both the name
He's just
and his
a guy.
look is just like some guy you, like, work with.
Yeah.
I mean, Fred Krueger is also just a name.
Well, I don't know. It's something I don't know. It's just regular enough. I don't know. Horace Pinker's trying too hard.
It's like, yeah.
So, because it seems to be the theme of the episode, I'm going to bring Tobe Hooper back here. One thing we've talked about in Life Force is how it just feels like there's so many different movies happening at once.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, they catch Pinker really early, and then there's that crazy plot pivot. There's the TV voodoo deity. It kind of feels like channel surfing at times. So what can you guys say about the pacing and structure of Shocker?
It's strange.
Yeah.
It's like 2 films, maybe 3 films in one. But I don't know. I don't mind. I think once Horace Pinker gets killed, I think it hits kind of a wild pace. Like I said, it becomes like kind of like one long chase, and I think it becomes a little less interesting when there's sequences of them like trying to solve the situation.
Yeah, right.
Like when he's like teaming up with his teammates. There's an interesting turn of phrase. When he's collaborating with his teammates to take down Pinker, it naturally becomes a little bit less interesting. But like a lot of the Craven movies, it is the sort of script that I could have seen Tobe Hooper making like a meal out of.
Yeah.
But I do think it's more satisfying for me than Deadly Blessing, despite them being like pretty similar movies in terms of like the amount of balls in the air.
They are.
No, I think Craven's having a lot of fun, and I think he gets to play around with kind of all of the ideas that interested him, or many of the ideas that interested him. The sort of the generational trauma stuff, the sort of like the media stuff that he'd go on to explore and Scream. It's kind of all here. I think I would never call it a subtle film. I don't think anybody would, but its media exploration is kind of subtle, or at least like less annoying than the media exploration in Scream. Like in Scream, that sort of stuff is handled in dialogue.
Yeah.
And here, besides the news anchors, which I don't know is so
they're mostly
over
just
the
giving
top
you
as to
plot.
become kind of funny, it's mostly visual.
Yeah.
There's that we put in the credit when the credits end, we zoom out from a TV and then pan away from another TV, as if we're so like TVs oftentimes have this kind of like they're like a visual motif throughout the film. They seem to like take us from place to place, and also there's always like some sort of horrible like tragedy on the TV in the background. It's always like war footage or like the Klan burning a cross.
Well, they're not like sitting you down and explaining a thing to you, the audience, right? They're just, it's like happening and something else is also happening that you could look at if you want to.
Well, Bennett, you mentioned in your notes, like, even how they have the newscasters covering it. It's like, oh my God, this killer, he's like perfect killer. Like, no one's going to catch him. He's so smart. Like, do you even know?
That's what I thought was so funny. That was why it totally made sense when I read that Craven quote about like wanting to make a character so good that Freddy Krueger has to retire. Because yeah, the first newscast we hear, they're literally like it's this laudatory coverage of the man they don't know as Horace Pinker. He's so brilliant. He's broken into houses undetected. He's thwarted capture for 9 months. Like he really does seem to predict the weird like fetishistic way people will talk about like serial killers and stuff now. Mm-hmm. Like that Ted Bundy documentary that came out a few years ago. I remember being like, God, like everyone they interviewed talks about Ted Bundy like he's like the fucking like friend they just met at school. It's like, and then he did this, and then he did this, and then he did this. Like, I don't know, Craven seems to predict like that. I mean, obviously some of that was going on already. You know, we had like the sort of like serial killer media sensations of like the 70s and 80s, but I don't know, like in the person of the anchors in Shocker, he seems to predict like true crime, like podcasting and the weird like breathless coverage of stuff like that.
So Bennett, you sent over an article before we started where Craven mentions his beliefs about TV. Do you have that quote handy by any chance?
Yeah, sure. It's from a film comment piece called Professor Gore. He's talking about how the film needed an extra little twist. And he says...
He's wrong.
I spent a lot of... Yeah, right. Wow. A movie... If ever there was a movie that didn't need anything extra, it's Shocker. The Trojans welcome the wooden horse into their city, reminds Craven. Television is the same. We welcome it into our house, not thinking about the threat it holds. On one level, Shocker is a horror film, but on another, it's something much more disturbing.
Ooh.
He really was, I think, like a Luddite. I think he really thought television was evil.
Right, yeah.
And I'm inclined to agree.
I mean,
There's
yeah,
nothing
he's
more
not
evil
wrong.
to me than prestige television. It's lowered all of our standards, not just our standards for art, our standards for everything. I'm inclined to agree with Craven, and I think that's what I like so
I
much.
don't
It's
think
one
he
of the
was
things I
talking
like
about
Shocker.
prestige TV, Ben.
Well, I don't think, such a thing didn't exist in 1989, but you know what I mean. Again, Craven, a pretty prescient guy, I think. A guy who, even if he didn't always, here I'm going to mix metaphors terribly, even if he didn't always hit it out of the park, he seems to have had his finger on the pulse.
Hey.
I don't know. I think he was pretty spot on in like talking about, I don't know, the sort of corrosive effect that television has. I don't know, like, obviously he couldn't have predicted prestige TV, he couldn't have predicted Game of Thrones, but like, I go on all the time about the corrosive effect I think Game of Thrones has on culture, and I think that's the sort of thing that Wes Craven was on about. It kind of like,
you don't think he's on about like the news? It seems like he's on. He's like if he's predicting anything, it feels like he's predicting the 24-hour news cycle.
Yeah, he's probably more thinking about that. But I don't know. For my purposes,
I'm just basing that on what's on the TVs in the movie. Mm-hmm. I'm just reading the text, Bennett.
Yeah, you're right. I'm bringing a lot of myself. No, but I think that's why, like, of his films, it's the one that, like, I gravitate the most to, just because, like, his kind of, like, alarmist, like, Luddite's attitude toward television, like, rhymes with mine, I guess.
So, Bennett, it's clear you think this is one of his finest films, maybe his best.
Oh, yeah. Number one.
Jim, I'm always curious about your ideas of how to improve movies. What do you think would make this a stronger movie? Because I can kind of get the feeling that you don't think this is necessarily his strongest.
I have two minor qualms with it. I'm sorry, Bennett. Well, I mean, one of them is purely situational. One of them is that this feels, yeah. One of them is that this feels like it's of the same era as like a Lawnmower Man, right? It's like being alarmist about a thing that feels kind of quaint now, which isn't a problem, but it flavors it when you watch it now in the future, right? You watch it and he's afraid of like cathode ray tube televisions, which feels a little weird because they look so charming to me. That's not a problem. It's just a bit, a thing. But for me, this movie is sort of in a couple of ways maximum Craven. It hits those. I think it does maybe the most with his sort of visual playfulness out of any of the movies. Maybe one of the two Nightmares he did is on the same level. Like maybe New Nightmare, but I think he maybe does more in this movie than he does. He certainly does more with less in this film than he does in anything else, visually. But in terms of an experience for me, this movie has long sequences where I'm just waiting to get to the next juicy part.
Yeah.
And I think that tightening the script up on this would really help a lot. Like, I don't care at all about that main character kid. I don't care about his girlfriend. I kind of love that she comes back as a ghost inexplicably. I love that there's, again, it's three, at least, separate unexplained phenomena, right? Like, the kid becomes a psychic, the murderer becomes a TV demon. And the girlfriend comes back as a ghost. None of those is connected. He doesn't, at the end, the devil doesn't pop out of the ground and be like, it was all me. There's nothing to tie them all together. They are completely separate. And I think that's charming. But I could spend a lot less time with that kid and his girlfriend. And ultimately, the kid and his stepfather at the end. If it was the kid and his coach for more of the movie, I would enjoy it. That coach is real fun.
The coach rules.
He's great, yeah.
I also love, and it's so weird that we don't get like any dialogue from him because he's featured so heavily in scenes. Is the manager? I think he's supposed to be the manager because he looks like sort of nerdy.
Ted Raimi.
We see him a lot, and then I don't think he ever gets any lines.
He has like one line. He says, because they say his name, he has a dumb name.
Scooter. Or
Scooter, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's Ted Raimi. It's Sam Raimi's brother, who's a champion. Yeah, he shows up like once and in one scene, and then the whole football team is like trying to beat up a ghost, and he's not there anymore or whatever, or maybe he died. Oh, he gets hanged in a closet, right?
He does get killed, which makes
you're like set it up a little.
Why
bit.
Wasn't he more of a character?
I mean, because Wes Craven shot that part, and then the movie was 4 hours long, and they had to cut it down. They just cut down the wrong parts. I think it could be tightened up a little bit. This movie. I
disagree, but it's the beauty of the podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Bennett wants the director's cut.
Yeah, he wants more.
I could have watched 3 hours of this movie.
If there was more and it made it cruise better, I would watch it. There's another also. Wait, here's a real specific critique. This movie also has, out of all the movies we watched, I think the most disappointing single moment for me, which is it's right after we've revealed that the necklace is the thing Horace Pinker's afraid of. He's inside the body of a construction worker. He's like just jumped into the first like threatening body that he's jumped into, and he walks over and he's holding, what is he holding, like a pickaxe? Yeah. He's holding some kind of manual labor tool. And he's like, ooh, I'm going to hit you with it. But then he scoops the necklace out of his hand with it. And then he hurls it through the air towards a lake. And it comes within, on screen, an inch of hitting a bird out of the sky, and it doesn't hit the bird out of the sky. If that tool smashed that bird, it would have been so easy to do. I think it was happenstance that they got the shot with the bird in it, but it would have been so easy for them to just go in there with an optical printer, and take 20 minutes and make that bird explode into feathers instead of continue flying. And it would have been a genius moment, but it doesn't happen. And that was, for me, incredibly disappointing. What?
For the character, it wouldn't have been out of character
no.
for Pinker or
right?
for Shocker.
You would have been like, oh, of course he's going to just murder a bird for no reason. Just to prove a point, right?
I gotta say, in the lake, my second favorite shot in the movie is when he's like, I gotta go diving for this, and his girlfriend appears and she's just like floating, and then he's like, no, and swims away, and then she's just like chasing behind him, just like arms outstretched. Just
so good.
It's
so good.
such a weird motion that I couldn't help
really
but
beautiful.
crack up.
It's weird how like sweet the stuff with him and his girlfriend is compared to like how like just like raw and like gross all the Pinker stuff is. Every other word, and not to sound like such a like I don't know, like a pearl clutching prude, but like every other word out of Pinker's mouth is fuck.
Yeah.
Come on.
Well, it's not.
Manners?
It's sometimes that's fun, right? But with Pinker, it feels unnecessary.
It feels like he's trying too hard.
Yeah,
like, it really does feel like he was trying to out Freddy.
Yeah.
Like, well, you think Freddy's profane?
Yeah.
But like I don't know, like the ending in particular with his girlfriend too is like very sweet. Like for whatever reason, again, this is never explained. Like he can still talk to his girlfriend. Like
well, she's a ghost,
even though he's like killed the she seems to imply that like she's not going to appear to him anymore because like the TV demon has been defeated, but she's still going to be like a voice in his head.
But her appearance, the first time she comes back as a ghost, is before there is a TV demon.
Does she appear to him before Pinker's dead?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Ooh, shit. I don't know. To me, she seemed to imply.
Like, maybe I'm misremembering, but I think I remember her popping up and being like, "Oh, weird," and then they catch Pinker.
I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but to me, she seemed to imply that like the nature of her like visitations were going to change. She has to like reassure him that she's still going to be around after he does some sort of like I don't know, Pinker destruction thing.
Sure. I mean, they have to be connected in some way because the necklace is like a magical trinket. I don't know.
Yeah, that the necklace is maybe one plot element too much.
It's pretty rough. It's also we see the whole trajectory of that necklace. He just gets her a necklace and gives it to her. It's like a fine. It's
he doesn't
not
buy
special.
It from some mysterious guy who's like, the necklace bears a terrible curse.
Yeah, no, nothing. He's just like, man, I got you a necklace, and then later it's like, the necklace, and you're like, well, that necklace didn't mean anything to anybody.
This is me being too charitable to the movie and like rewriting a version of the movie in my head where this stuff like makes sense.
And that's the better version of the movie.
Well, no, there is no better version of this movie. Although apparently he talked about like wanting to remake this.
He should have.
Like late in life.
Somebody should have.
I would have loved to see him do another Shocker.
Yeah. Or he could have just made a sequel. He could have just been like Shocker 2, assholes. That would be what it was called.
I really, I wish that had been the stipulation in his contract with Miramax that he could make Shocker 2 and not music from the heart.
So that is kind of the big thing with this movie is that he wanted this so badly to be a franchise that he just like threw everything he had at it, and it doesn't stick. But then he has Scream later that became, I mean, arguably one of the 3-4 most famous horror franchises in history, right?
Here's the thing about Scream, I think, is that Scream is the point in his career where he stops writing his movies. And Scream, that script is incredibly tight. Say what you will about it. It is very much up its own ass. But it's also, I think the Scream movies are more Kevin Williamson than they are Wes Craven. Kevin Williamson, who wrote Scream 1 and 2 and 4, who also wrote The Faculty, unarguably the greatest Robert Rodriguez film.
Yeah.
I Know What You Did Last Summer. And then in the middle of that created Dawson's Creek, which is Scream without murders, right? It's very Kevin Williamson. It's like definitely from that guy. And I think that is why those movies, I think I give almost all of the credit. I think Wes Craven got those made. I think that they are in his interest range for sure. I see why he wanted to make them. But I don't think the thing that made those movies Katy Perry songs, to continue my pop metaphor, is Wes Craven.
I talked about liking the third one in particular. I think
that's the one Kevin
Williamson
Williamson didn't write. I need to watch that.
Yeah, I think that's where we see
wasn't
his
a big
kind of
fan,
meta interests. I think it's better than New Nightmare, honestly.
I bet you're right. I bet that's where Craven peaks through the most, because that's the one that someone else wrote that he probably had more of a hand in it, right?
Oh, and Craven also wrote, Jim, you're not quite accurate. Craven wrote My Soul to Take.
Right, he also wrote some other stuff nobody talks about.
Maybe?
No, Cursed, also written by Kevin Williamson.
Really? Oh,
although
that's studio interference in the movie.
Yeah, I read about that one a little bit because I was like, this movie was 8 times this long, and they cut it all out. And then I read it, and there was a quote from Judy Greer that was like, we shot 4 movies here.
It has good bits.
It has great bits, that movie.
Reeks of, just...
But such a mess.
Because there's so much of it that's, like, pretty fun.
Yeah.
And then it's...
Bennett, I have a counterpoint to Scream 3. So, Brett and I watched Scream 3, and we both thought it was fine. But then we watched New...
Counterpoint done, asshole.
Shit, you got me. But we watched New Nightmare after Scream 3. And seeing what he'd already done in New Nightmare, just knowing Scream 3 came after it, I thought kind of just essentially invalidated all of Scream 3, because it just does it in a cheaper way where it's like, we're on the set of a movie that we're making about a movie that's already been made that's in a movie franchise. You know, it just seemed like so much just beating you over the head with like, this is meta.
I don't know. I hear that and I raise you Parker Posey as
she was
the
great.
Actress playing Gail Weathers. I don't know. Like, I just think it's so much fun. And he has like the perfect cast.
They're
for
very
it.
much of separate eras, right? Like New Nightmare is being metatextual in a world where that's like a fairly fresh idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Scream 3 is being Scream 3 after the first 2 Scream movies. It's that
And
Scream we should mention
of
is like,
imitators.
yeah, of course. Scream is that first or the third of his like major epoch shifts that Wes Craven is credited with, right?
Right, yeah, we forgot that part.
where everyone's like, horror movies kind of flag in the late 80s into the early 90s, and then we're dying, and Scream comes along and is like, you can just make fun of horror movies in your horror movie, and then it's fun again. And that's that big
It gives
motion,
birth
right?
to like a new boom for teen slashers.
So I think Scream 3 is made in a different world than New Nightmare. To its
in a
credit,
different class,
I haven't
too.
rewatched it in a long time, so I don't remember. I'm not getting in on this fight between y'all
I'm
about
getting
which
more
one's better.
pugnacious in my film takes. I don't know if you guys have noticed.
That's good. Eventually you'll be an old man.
We'll settle this in the dungeon of the Split Tooth compound later.
Yeah.
So I think my final question is about Craven as a whole. What do you feel are his greatest strengths and his greatest weaknesses as a filmmaker?
I mean, I feel like I've already said this, but I'll try to restate it in a more charming way. I think similar, we've sort of touched on, I think we keep coming back to Tobe Hooper, because I think Craven and Tobe Hooper have a similarity in that their strengths are in these sort of like juicy moments, but I think Tobe Hooper's are all straight from his crotch, and I think Wes Craven's are all straight from his brain. I think he's like the intellectual counterpoint to Tobe Hooper, right? He's very smart at coming up with these conceits and playing out the conceits in a really gratifying way on screen. And I really think that's where I think when his movies are solid hits, that's where it's coming from, is this sort of, he's come up with that's not grimy. He's come up with like a really sort of convoluted, complicated thing that he wants to make using an optical printer and a puppet. And he's doing it, but it feels like it's coming from a man with a degree in philosophy. And I think that the worst parts of his filmmaking are sort of him working with actors. It's the parts where he's trying to string things together. I do think it's interesting that he has a degree in literature also, because his scripts they don't hang together like film scripts, right? And I think that's the difference with the Scream ones. They're written by a dude who's like a consummate screenwriter, and they're very sort of tightly put together. Whereas a Wes Craven script is a bunch of ideas that would probably fit in something shaped like and the length of a novel, but that are not well suited necessarily to making a tight movie. So I think those parts, I think the trying to make it hang together and the trying to get actors to do specific things are maybe where he is at his weakest.
Yeah, I would basically agree with what Jim said there. I think his strengths really lie in coming up with incredible sequences, incredible effects. I think he's really tapped into... I think he gets what's scary. I think Hooper has the images that like upset me the most viscerally, but I think Craven is a close second. I think a lot of the dream stuff in his movies is really tapped into just, I don't know, just the elemental things that sort of like turn your stomach and like creep you out. I think he's, very obviously coming to screenwriting from an intellectual perspective and not a storytelling perspective. And as much as I roll my eyes at directors being like, we're storytellers deep down, you do sort of need a little bit of that sensibility generally. And I don't know how much Craven had it. So I think his weak points are evident in, the question of whether or not his scripts hang together. And asking actors to do a lot of like emotional heavy lifting. I think he was really, really good at casting.
Yeah.
He was really good at casting, especially later in his career, for like the meta resonance of it all.
Yeah.
Like I think Scream 2 has like the best cast ever assembled. Jerry O'Connell, Portia de Rossi, Sarah Michelle Gellar, just every fucking TV actor from like the 90s and 2000s is in that movie. Joshua Jackson is in a single scene. Timothy Olyphant is one of the killers. That's TV, baby. Like he had like, I think in general, like good instincts about like who to cast, but I don't think he ever really got great performances out of anybody other than like Robert Englund and Matthew Lillard.
and again, I would say those dudes both are coming in swinging regardless of who the boss is.
Yeah, they're two guys who are probably never going to be uninteresting.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so let's wrap this up. Let's do our picks. Bennett, you have already said you think this is
real wrap it up.
Yeah. So Bennett, you've already
That's a real wrap.
Bennett, you've mentioned you think this is Shocker is Craven's best film. Why do you think this is superior to Deadly Blessing?
Yeah, bring it.
I mean, I think it probably just comes down to like Craven had some more at bats. I think he was a little bit surer of himself. I think he'd had time to sort of ruminate on some more ideas. So these are definitely both, everything but the kitchen sink. Hey, what about the kitchen sink kind of movies? And I think he was a little bit more confident. And I think the script is like a notch tighter for Shocker. I think it coheres a touch better. And then I think that final sequence, which I realized we didn't mention, where they're jumping from like TV screen to TV screen, kind of like the ending of Sherlock Jr. Like, I think that's just the most like thrilling thing he ever came up with. Just such a wild sequence. Because you know what the ending of Sherlock Jr. was missing? It didn't have like a news anchor talking over it, talking about people are reporting seeing Horace Pinker and Jonathan Parker. I imagine having like a DJ talking over the ending of Sherlock Jr., which apparently So in Uganda, I don't know if you're familiar with Wakali.
Of course.
If you're familiar with Wakaliwood, like they apparently like will show screenings of movies with like video DJs, and there are like VJ'd movies from like the silent era. Like there is like video jockeys over Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin. Like
that sounds amazing.
This is the closest thing to that you're gonna get in I think an American film is the ending of Shocker. You have basically a video jockey talking over,
just telling you what's happening while it's
a riff on Sherlock Jr. And it's kind of incredible. I think Wes Craven is probably the weakest of the four big masters we're covering with the split picks, but still
that's still a good place
really
to be. Yeah,
right. Yeah,
a lot more hits than he gets credit for.
Yeah,
obviously the three big epochal movies deserve their reputations, but if you ask me, Serpent and the Rainbow is really great. Scream 3 is really great. Shocker is really great. And then stuff like Deadly Friend and Deadly Blessing are tons of fun. His TV movies are a lot of fun. He has very few complete duds, but he's weaker than like Hooper, Romero, Carpenter for me because I'll grant that he has like two complete duds.
Yeah.
So Jim, what about you? Deadly Blessing versus Shocker. What are you taking?
I think I said this in bits across the episode, but for me, I do think Shocker has some stronger beats than Deadly Blessing. But for me, Deadly Blessing is a fun ride the whole time, and Shocker feels it really. There's parts of it where I'm kind of waiting it out. So if I was gonna rewatch one right now, it would either be a supercut of the best moments of Shocker or all of Deadly Blessing.
That's a good answer. Well, you guys have any final thoughts on Wes Craven before we go?
Watch the stuff you haven't seen before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The big ones are all fun, but the smaller ones are maybe funner.
And give the Nightmare sequels a try. I've only seen 2, 3, and New Nightmare. But
I've seen all of
liked
them.
all
They're
them.
all good.
Yeah.
People say they fall off at some point, but they're wrong.
All right. Well, Jim, Bennett, thank you guys so much for joining us. It's always a blast having you two aboard. Bennett, you're coming back next week. We're wrapping up the series. We're looking at George A. Romero. You
Split
have
pick all-star.
Yeah, we have already got an essay from you. One of the second October horror essay we had on Split Tooth Media. You want to tell us what you picked?
For George A. Romero, yeah, I'll be talking about his classic film, his masterpiece, Martin, which, Jim, you haven't seen?
I've seen Martin.
Oh, it's your email, but I seem to imply that you'd only seen...
Oh, no, I just couldn't
Dead
remember
movies.
what ones I'd seen.
Got it, sorry.
I know I've seen all the Time of Day of the Deads, and I know I've seen Night Riders.
Night Riders is my favorite.
Night Riders is my
I
favorite, too.
love that one.
And I've seen Martin. I think I've seen maybe... I don't know. I think I may have seen that one. Did you just 10,000 Maniacs? Is that him?
No, that's...
The Crazies? The Crazies.
That's
Crazy, yes,
10,000
yes.
Maniacs is a band, isn't it?
No, 2000 Maniacs is Herschel Gordon Lewis.
2000 Maniacs. Thank you.
Yeah.
Herschel Gordon Lewis. I've seen a lot of that guy.
Yeah, that's a great one. All right, well, thank you everyone for listening. This is week 3 of our split picks, looking at the American. It should be called Mount Rushmore. I'm sticking to it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it can be. Isn't that your call? Just make it be that. Who cares?
All right, we'll be back. We got more great essays coming up. Thank you for listening. I'm Craig. With me,
Bennett Glaze.
And Bennett Glaze.
excellent. All right.
For Bennett Glaze, I'm Bennett Glaze.